Imagine taking a bullet for another man, only to be left for dead with a festering wound. That was the exact fix Elias Ward was in, and you'll want to stick around to see how this one turns out. Back in the late 1870s, the wind in the Colorado Territory didn't just blow, it scoured the land raw, and the little town of Blackwood was just a tough collection of lumber and mud, holding on for dear life. To the west, the timbered hills rose up, a place of deep, quiet shadows. And into those hills rode Elias, a lone figure on a horse that looked just as weary as him. He was a man worn down to the bone by hard living, with tired, storm-gray eyes. He used to be a scout who could read the land like a book, but now he was just a hired gun. Out on the edges were little sod-roofed homes, hunkered low against the wind, where families fought the earth just to get beacon. The fella he saved just patched him up with a canvas needle and sent him on his way with $50. Now that wound was burning like a hot coal, the infection creeping in slow and steady. Elias knew the signs, and he knew his time was running short. He pushed his horse Banjo up the trail, needing water and a place to hide from prying eyes. But the fever was taking hold, and the wind in the pines started to sound an awful lot like cannons from the war. For a second, the gray rocks looked like the uniforms of dead boys on a battlefield, a memory he could never escape. He could read the land like a book, but now he was just another hired gun for the railroad, paid next to nothing. He shifted in his saddle, hissing as a sharp pain shot through his side. A week back, a squabble over a surveyor's stake got ugly. Elias took a bullet for a man who didn't even bother to say thanks. The surveyor stitched him up with a tent needle, handed him $50 and a canteen of awful whiskey, and sent him on his way. Now that wound was on fire. A deep, throbbing heat that had settled right into his bones. Elias knew the signs, the angry red streaks, the swelling and the heat, like a hot coal pressed to his skin. An infection was taking hold, creeping in slow and sure like a long shadow at sundown. He urged his horse, a gelding he called Banjo, up the steep, rocky trail. He needed fresh water and a fire hidden from the town folks below and any outlaws roaming the passes. As the horse climbed, Elias's mind began to wander, lost in the fever. The wind whispering through the pines started to sound like cannon fire from the war. He blinked, and the gray rocks looked like the gray uniforms of fallen boys on a Virginia field. He remembered the smoke, how it tasted like sulfur and blood in his mouth. He remembered the awful noise and then the silence that followed, which was always worse. He saw a young lieutenant's face, a boy, just 19, holding his own guts and crying for his mama. He saw the maps again, spread out on camp tables. He saw officers arguing about land they had never seen, moving men like pawns. Elias knew that ravine was a death trap. He had told them, but they would not listen. He shook his head, trying to clear the memory. That was a lifetime ago. At 35, he felt 100. After Appomattox, he walked away with a bitter heart. He felt used up and tossed aside like a spent shell casing. The country he fought for moved on, chasing gold and new land. But men like him were just left to wander, haunted by the ghosts of that war. The trail finally opened up into a small, hidden meadow, right up against a tall granite cliff. An icy stream cut through it, the water running fast and black. It was a good, defensible spot. Elias slid down from the saddle, his knees buckling on the frozen ground. He grabbed the stirrup just to keep himself standing. Easy now, he mumbled to himself. Just make camp. He pulled the gear off of Banjo, slow and clumsy. That saddle felt like it weighed a ton. He hobbled his horse in the best patch of dead grass, then finally turned to his own sorry state. He had to get that wound clean. He had to wash his clothes before the infection finished him off. It was pure madness to strip down in this biting cold. But the fever had a firm hold on him now. He gathered up some dry pine and coaxed a little fire to life at the base of the cliff. The flames shot up, orange and hungry, making the shadows dance against the rock. With trembling fingers, he unbuttoned his shirt. It was stuck fast to his side with dried blood. He peeled it away with a pained look and tossed it near the water. He unbuckled his gun belt, letting the heavy Colt revolver fall to his bedroll. Then his trousers, his boots, all gray with trail dust. He stood there, naked in the wind, his body a road map of his past. The puckered scar on his shoulder, from a saber at Bull Run, the burn on his thigh from a powder mishap, and now this new angry gash. The wound on his ribs was raw and festering. He stepped into the stream, and the water burned like fire. It stole the breath right out of his lungs. He gritted his teeth and scrubbed at his wounded side. He washed his clothes as best he could, wringing them out and draping them on the rocks near the fire. Shivering something fierce, he stumbled back to the warmth. The deep cold was fighting the fever inside him. He wrapped his one thin wool blanket around himself and curled up on the hard, cold earth. He just needed an hour of sleep. Then he would tend his wound and get back on the trail. But when sleep came, it was not rest. It felt like falling. The fever rose like a flood, drowning his senses. The darkening twilight sky began to spin, and the first stars started to blur. Light bled through the clouds like embers from a dying campfire. Somewhere out in the dark, a lone coyote started to howl. In his fevered mind, Elias heard it as a rebel yell. "Hold the line," he rasped. He thrashed and kicked the blanket away, his body burning up from the inside. His mind was back in the war, trying to save a friend who was already lost. "I'm sorry, he whispered to the empty night. "I surely tried." The campfire popped, but Elias didn't so much as blink. He lay helpless, his rifle just 5 feet away, completely useless to him now. He was all alone in the great, silent Rockies. Past the fever, a deep and final cold began to creep into his bones. High above, on a wind-whipped ridge, Willa paused. She was a creature of this land. She was only 24, but her face carried the weariness of a long, hard life. Her dark, tangled hair was pulled back with a strip of leather. She wore no dresses, just the practical clothes of a man. Her buckskin coat was so patched up, it looked more like a well-worn map. A Winchester rifle, always clean, rested easy in her arm. A heavy skinning knife was strapped to her hip, ready for work. The folks down in the town of Blackwood had all sorts of names for her. Witch, savage, feral. She had heard them all on the wind. They spun tales that an Indian raid took her family 10 years ago. They said she lived with the tribes and became one of them, losing her soul. The truth was simpler and a whole lot harder. Her only crime was that she survived when everyone else died. She refused to beg for pity from the people who had turned a blind eye. She was checking her traps, moving with a quiet grace, a skill she learned from the Ute band that found her, starving and half-frozen. They did not offer pity. They offered lessons on how to live. They taught her the land is a parent. It can be kind and it can be cruel. Then she smelled it, the sharp scent of a wood fire. A fire meant people, and out here, people usually meant danger. Will moved with a practiced quiet, her eyes searching the dark meadow below. She saw one lame horse, a dying fire, and a heap on the ground. She frowned. This was not an outlaw camp. They would have a guard, or at least be making a racket. And it was not hunters, not with just one horse. She drifted down the slope, silent as a shadow. Her hand stayed ready on her knife. At the edge of the firelight, she froze, her breath catching sharp. A man was laying there, completely bare. Will blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her in the dim light. He was sprawled out on his back, thrown about like he had been dropped from the sky. His clothes were frozen stiff on the rocks. She stepped into the light, rifle up, expecting a trap. But the fella did not stir. She looked him over. He was lean, all tough, muscle and bone. His skin was pale and slick with sweat, even in the freezing air. But it was the scars that really caught her eye. They covered him like a crazy road map, with old bullet holes and long white knife cuts. He looked like he had been taken apart and put back together a dozen times. Then she saw his side. A bandage was loose, showing a nasty, angry wound seeped with infection. The skin all around it was fiery red. What a fool, she thought to herself. A dang fool to be out here bare-skinned in the cold. His breath came in ragged little gasps. He mumbled something, thrashing his head back and forth. "Forward," he rasped. "Keep moving." Will backed away. Her rule for 10 years was to leave folks like this, never trust a stranger, never let them get close. She remembered the last time strangers came to her family's home. They had brought nothing but fire and ruin. She studied his face under all that dirt and beard. He seemed young, or maybe just plain broken. There was no meanness in his face, just a deep-down weariness. He was a goner for sure. If the cold did not get him, that infection would by morning. The coyotes were already singing his funeral song. Will turned to go, back toward the safety of the trees. It would be so easy to just walk away and let the winter take him. But then she spotted his canteen. It was an army canteen, stamped with a U.S. His scars were from fights he had survived, not started. He was wounded and on the run. Maybe he was just like her. She looked out at the huge, empty valley. Lord, there was nobody coming for him. Nobody even knew he was out here. He was all alone in the world. Something twisted up inside Will's chest. She knew that feeling all too well. She knew what it felt like to be thrown away, to be seen as less than a person, or not be seen at all. Dang it, she whispered into the quiet. She just could not do it. She could not leave him out here to die. With her mind made up, she moved fast. She knelt down and put a hand on his forehead. He was burning up with a terrible fever. "Hey, wake up," she said, shaking his shoulder hard. Elias groaned. His eyes fluttered open but saw nothing. He swung a weak arm, mumbling about soldiers. Willa grabbed his wrist, her grip like iron. "Hush now," she said. "You ain't fighting a war tonight." She took her prized buffalo blanket from her pack. She tucked the heavy robe around his shivering body, then went to quiet his horse. She saddled the animal with sure hands and gathered up his frozen clothes. She shoved them in his saddlebags and checked his gun belt out of habit. After hanging it on the saddle horn, she walked back to Elias. "This is fixin' to hurt," she said plainly, "and you're heavy, so don't you fight me." With that, she hauled him up to sit. Elias cried out in agony but was far too weak to fight back. Willa crouched low and pulled his arm over her shoulder. "Up," she commanded, using all her might. She was not a big woman, but she was made of pure grit and determination. She got him to his feet, his dead weight nearly crushing her as he stumbled. "Move your feet, cowboy," she grunted, staggering toward her pack horse. It was a hard, ugly struggle, and they almost fell twice. She cursed him, the snow, and the soft heart she didn't know she still had. When she got him to her horse, she knew he was too heavy to lift into the saddle. Instead, she slung him over the animal like a sack of grain and tied his legs down. It wasn't dignified, but it would get the job done. She took the reins and began the climb. The path to her cabin was a hidden deer track that wound up through the timber. It was steep and icy. Willa led the way, her breath fogging in the cold. She never looked back, just kept putting one foot in front of the other. She'd risked her quiet life, bringing a wolf right into her den. If he turned on her, all this effort would be for nothing. An hour later, they reached the cabin. It was tucked away in the hills, sheltered by a cliff and old pine trees. Built of logs and river stone, it was low and sturdy to handle the heavy snows. Willa untied Elias and he slid limp into her arms. She dragged him inside. She kicked the door shut against the wind. The cabin smelled of sage and wood smoke. She hauled him to a narrow bed made of pine and rawhide, covered in furs. Gasping for breath, she wiped the sweat from her eyes and lit the lantern. Golden light filled the small room, showing a rough table and a cast-iron stove. With herbs hanging from the ceiling, Willa stoked the fire till it roared and put a pot on to boil. She put water on the fire, then turned to the stranger. He was shaking something fierce, his teeth chattering. Willa pulled off the wet buffalo robe and the damp blanket he was wrapped in. He lay there, bone-pale against the dark furs of her bed. She saw his ribs showing, a kind of hunger she knew all too well. Then she noticed a scar on his shoulder, shaped just like a star. Willa went right to work, cleaning the deep gash with hot water and soap. He moaned in his sleep, but she kept on, slathering it with a salve of pine pitch and yarrow. She tore strips from one of her own few shirts and bound his ribs up good and tight. He started to thrash, fighting enemies only he could see. "None of that now," she said. Using soft rawhide, she tied his wrists to the bed frame, not to hurt him, but to keep him safe. The cabin was warm now, and Elias's breathing finally deepened into a peaceful sleep. The haunted look on his face seemed to melt away in the firelight. A strange, heavy weight settled in her gut. For 10 years, she had been beholden to nobody. She was a story. Now, a living man was in her bed. She brushed the hair from his fevered brow. "You gave me no choice," she whispered. "You laid down in the snow to die. I couldn't just let the mountain have you." Her small cabin, her whole world, suddenly felt much smaller. "I brought you here," she said, her voice low and fierce. "That makes you mine to keep alive." Her hand rested on her knife. "You're claimed, stranger," she said, like someone drawing a line in the dirt. She was defying the man who'd wronged her family, and she was defying death itself. She pulled a chair to his side, her rifle resting across her knees. She decided she would not sleep that night. She would simply watch over him. Outside, the snow fell heavy, burying their tracks and sealing them away from the world. The fire crackled, casting long shadows over the sleeping man and the wild girl who guarded him. The light that finally woke Elias Ward was thin and gray, seeping through the logs like dirty dishwater. She pulled a chair next to the bed and sat, her rifle resting across her lap. She wasn't about to sleep tonight. She would just watch. She would listen to his breathing and the howl of the wind. The snow was coming down hard now, covering their tracks. It sealed the little cabin off from the rest of the world. Inside, the fire crackled, making shadows dance on the walls. They danced over the sleeping man and the wild-eyed girl who watched him, her gaze ancient and afraid, but fiercely alive. The light that woke Elias Ward was thin and gray, like dirty water seeping through the logs. He did not recognize the ceiling. It wasn't the open sky or a canvas tent. It was made of rough, heavy timber. He felt like he was floating up from the bottom of a deep, dark well. His body felt heavy and distant. It ached with a dull, steady rhythm. He tried to move, his body reacting before his mind could. He tensed up, trying to roll and grab the Colt that should have been right there. But he could not move a muscle. His wrists were tied tight. Not with iron, but with something soft that still held him firm to the bed frame. A cold, sharp panic cut right through his fever. He yanked hard, the breath catching in his throat. A white-hot pain shot through his left side. He gasped, arching his back against the ropes. He fought like a trapped animal, buzzed of desperate, blind panic. He figured he was a prisoner. Maybe the war had found him again, or the surveyors had turned on him. "You best stop that," a voice said. A voice said, calm and low. It sure was not a man's. It cut right through his own heavy breathing. Elias froze, his heart just a hammering. He slowly turned his aching head. A woman stood at the foot of his bed, a dark shape against the window. As his eyes cleared, he saw she was dressed in buckskins and men's pants. Her dark hair was pulled back from a face that had seen a lot of sun. She held a Winchester rifle in her arm, easy-like, and a big knife was at her belt. "If you keep flopping like a fish on the bank, you'll tear your stitches," she said. "And I am not fixing to sew you up again. I have used enough thread on you." Elias stared, his mind spinning. He looked down and saw he was under a pile of furs. Underneath all that fur, the cool air told him he was as bare as the day he was born. "Where are my clothes?" he croaked out. "And where in the world is my gun?" The woman nodded toward the stone hearth. His duster and shirt were hanging there to dry. His gun belt was coiled on a wooden peg, far out of his reach. His own Henry rifle was propped up by the door, also too far away. "Your clothes are drying," she told him. "I had to wash all the blood out of them. As for the gun, it is staying right where it is. I do not aim to get shot in my own house." Elias pulled at the ties on his wrists. They were soft cloth, tied in a cavalry hitch. "Untie me," he said, trying to sound like he was in charge. "I will," she said, not moving a muscle. "When you promised to stay put, you were fighting devils in your sleep. You were trying to tear your own side open, mister. I did not haul you all the way up here for that, just to watch you bleed out on my bed." Elias fell back on the pillow. The fight just drained right out of him. He remembered the ice-cold stream and the world spinning sideways. He looked at the woman again. She was small but stood as solid as an old oak tree. "You brought me here," he asked. She nodded. "I found you by the creek. You were buck naked and burning with fever. Looked like you were trying to freeze solid. I put you on my horse and brought you up here." "Why?" Elias asked, not trusting the kindness. In the West, charity was a rare thing that always had a price. The woman's face hardened. She shifted her rifle. "Because I am a fool, I reckon. Now, are you going to behave? Or do I leave you tied up while I check my traps?" "I will behave," Elias said, knowing he was beat. Willa leaned her rifle against the wall and walked to the bed, moving with a hunter's silence. She pulled a knife from her belt. Elias flinched, but she paid him no mind. With a quick, practiced move, she sliced through the cloth strips, freeing his hands. She sheathed the knife and stepped back fast, putting space between them. "Don't stand up too quick," she warned. "You have lost blood." Elias rubbed his raw wrists and pulled the furs up to his chin. He was suddenly very aware of his nakedness under her steady gaze. It was not a look of desire. It was how a rancher looks at a sick calf, just sizing him up. "Who are you?" Yaoopti asked. "Willa Kane," she said. Elias paused. He knew that name from the whispers in town. The wild girl. "The townsfolk say you are dead," Elias said, "or gone to live with the tribes." Willa made a short, sharp sound that was almost a laugh. "They say a lot of things in Blackwood. Most of it is horse manure. And who are you sleeping in the snow with a hole in your ribs?" "Elias Ward," he said, but the name meant nothing to her. The war was 10 years gone. "I was guiding surveyors for the railroad," Elias explained, his voice getting a little stronger. "We ran into some trouble down in the basin, a dispute with men from a cattle outfit." "Which outfit?" Willa asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "The Lazy P," Elias said. He saw her jaw tighten for just a second. "You made enemies of them?" she asked. "I did not care for their methods," Elias said, "or for men who shoot from cover. I took a bullet for another man. I rode out before they could finish the job." Willa watched him for a long moment, searching his face. When she saw he was telling the truth, her shoulders relaxed just a bit. "You are safe enough here," she said. "No one comes up this high, not the Lazy P and not the law." She turned to the stove. She poured a tin cup full of black, steaming coffee and set it on a stool by the bed. "Drink," she ordered. "Then sleep. I have got work to do." She grabbed her coat and went to the door. She turned back at the door. "Don't you get any ideas about my horse or guns, Elias Ward. I know this mountain, and you wouldn't make it 100 yards. "I believe you," Elias said. Willa gave a sharp nod and slipped out. 3 days later, the big storm hit. It started as a dark bruise in the northern sky. By noon, the wind was howling. It tore at the cabin's roof and pushed snow right through the cracks in the logs. Inside, their whole world was a single 12-by-2 room. Elias was finally sitting up. The fever had broken, but it left him weak and stiff as an old board. Still, his head was clear. He watched Willa. She never wasted a single movement. Every step had a reason, from stoking the fire to making biscuits. He felt useless, and he flat out hated that feeling. He was a man who pulled his own weight. Watching her haul firewood while he sat wrapped in a blanket just ate at his pride. "Let me get that," Elias said, reaching for the water bucket. She spun around, her eyes flashing fire. "Sit down," she said. "I can get water," he argued. "I am not helpless." "You are close enough," she snapped. "You ripped those stitches, and I have to sew you up again, and I'm low on whiskey to numb the pain." "This is not right," Elias said, grabbing the bucket handle. "It's like I'm your burden." Willa snatched the bucket back with surprising strength. "I am not your servant," Shawitawet, her toes dropping low. "This is my cabin, my land, and my rules. You will do what I say. Or you can go sleep out in the shed with the horses." Elias met her stare. He saw her grit. He saw the wall she'd built to survive. He let go of the bucket. "All right," he said softly. "Your rules." She watched him for a second, then turned and walked right out into the storm. When she came back, caked in snow, Elias was waiting by the stove. He had not touched the bucket. Instead, he had found her knife in the pile of potatoes. They were all peeled and sliced, ready for the pot. He offered the knife back to her. "Handle first." "I can peel potatoes," he said. "That doesn't take much strength." Willa looked from the potatoes to him. The corner of her mouth twitched into a tiny smile. "They are cut too thick," she said. "But they'll do." And just like that, it was a truce. As the storm buried them in snow, they found a rhythm. Willa would hunt when the wind let it up, bringing back a rabbit or a grouse. Elias would clean it, his hands getting steadier each day. They did not talk much. The silence was filled by the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. And Elias watched her. He watched how she checked the door latch 3 times every single night. She ate like someone might snatch her plate. He saw a loneliness in her that he knew all too well. He filled the long nights by telling her stories. He spoke of cities back east and oceans he'd seen. He told her about the strange ways soldiers find things to laugh about, but he never mentioned the fighting. He figured she'd seen enough trouble. She'd listen while her hands were busy mending something. Her questions were always sharp. She'd ask how a steam engine worked, or the half price of coffee in St. Louis. She wanted to know why men would fight over lines on a map. One night he looked at her and spoke his mind. "You've got a sharp mind, Willa, doll," he said. "You could make it down into the flatlands." "That world?" she snorted. "Down there, they think I'm a witch or something worse. Why would I ever want to be a part of that?" Elias shook his head. "Folks are foolish. They're scared of what they can't control," he said. Willa corrected him. "And nobody controls me." He admired that steel in her spine, but he knew it came at a high price. The nights were the worst part. The cold was so bitter, the nails in the walls would pop like gunshots. The little stove fought hard, but it was no match for a true mountain winter. The cabin just had the one bed. For the first 2 nights, Elias insisted on sleeping on the floor, wrapped in his coat. He was trying to be a gentleman. Sharing that little bed with her just did not feel right. But on the third night, the cold was a heavy, mean thing. Lying on the floorboards, his teeth were chattering so hard his jaw ached. A draft cut right through him. From the dark, Willa's voice cut through the silence. "Get up," she said. He shivered. "I'm all right." "Your shaking is so loud I cannot sleep," she said. "Get in the bed." He paused. "It is not proper." She let out a hard laugh. "Proper? Mister, we are miles from any town. And if you freeze solid on my floor, I am not digging a grave in this hard ground." "Now get in the bed," she ordered. So Elias pulled himself up, shivering something fierce. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Boots off," she said. He kicked them off and slid under the furs. The bed was mighty narrow. Willa was pressed up against the wall, her back to him. He laid there on the very edge, stiff as a board, afraid to even breathe too hard. He could feel the heat coming off her, a small comfort in the big cold. "Good night, Willa," he whispered into the dark. "Go to sleep, mister," she mumbled back. The air between them was tense. Every little sound was sharp and loud in the quiet. He felt her stiffen every time he shivered, but finally being tired won out over everything else. Sometime before dawn, Elias woke up. The space between them was gone. He had moved, looking for warmth. His back was right up against hers, feeling the warmth from her flannel shirt. He knew he should move, but that heat was just too good to let go. They stayed like that, breathing together as the wind howled outside. Night after night, the awkwardness between them started to fade away. It was just two people trying to survive in a frozen world. One night, his hand touched her hip in his sleep, and he snatched it back fast. Willa didn't move, but she took a sharp breath and didn't push him away. Then came the night when the cold truly bit down hard. The wind stopped, leaving a silence that felt like the air itself had frozen solid. Even the water in the bucket by the stove was a block of ice. Elias was already in bed, shaking bad, his old wound aching something fierce. Willa climbed in, wearing every piece of clothing she had, but the cold was too much. "Elias," she whispered. The first time she used his name. He just chattered his teeth. She said, "We're not going to make it like this." Her voice was quiet, all the fight gone out of it. "What should we do?" he asked. She took a deep breath and turned to face him in the dark. "Come here," she said. For just a second, Elias waited. Then he moved toward her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her in close. Willa buried her face in his neck, her hands gripping his shirt. The feeling of her against him was a shock, like a bolt of lightning. He could feel her heart beating fast, like a trapped bird against his own chest. They lay there, huddled together for survival. Elias curled his body around hers, sharing his warmth as she shared hers. Her hair smelled like wood smoke, and he had to fight the urge to kiss the top of her head. He wouldn't cross that line. He would not be that kind of man. Willa was stiff in his arms for a torrent while her breath warm on his neck. For 10 long years, nothing had touched her but the wind and the snow. To feel a person's touch again was almost too much to handle. It scared her more than the storm, but that fear slowly melted away. Soon she relaxed and her hand rested right over his heart. "He's alive," she reckoned. "I kept him going, and now he's keeping me warm." They fell asleep all tangled up as the storm finally broke 2 days later. The world was scrubbed clean and bright white. Elias and Willa sat by the stove, sipping the last of the coffee. The closeness from the cold nights was unspoken, but it was real. They moved around each other differently now, and their hands brushed by the coffee pot. Neither of them pulled away. Elias studied her face in the hard light from the window. He saw the stubborn set of her chin. "Why do they call it a raid?" he asked, his voice low. Willa went still, her eyes holding a deep, old pain. "Because the truth is a whole lot harder," she said. "Tell me," he urged gently. Willa looked down at her scarred hands. "My pa had the best water rights here. He homesteaded 40 acres of bottomland, all fair and square. Harlan Pike wanted it bad. He made an offer, but my pa told him no. So Pike offered less money. Pa told him to get off our land." She looked up, her eyes burning. 2 nights later, masked riders came. I knew them by their silver spurs, shaped like stars. "Those are Pike's men." "What happened then?" Elias asked softly. "They burned our cabin and shot Pa in the doorway. Ma hid me in the root cellar, told me to be quiet. I heard what they did to her before they finished it." Her voice finally cracked. "When they set the fire, I waited till the heat was burning my skin. Then I ran into the dark. I just ran up into the timber." "What about the town?" Elias asked. Willa let out a bitter laugh. "The town? Pike told the sheriff it was Utes. The law takes Pike's money, so he just agreed. They wrote down Indian raid in the book. If I go down there to tell what really happened, I'm just the crazy girl from the woods. Nobody's going to believe me over a man like Pike. He owns half this county." She stared into the flames. "So I stay up here, and I wait." Elias felt a cold, familiar anger building in his gut. He knew men exactly like Pike. He had seen their kind getting rich during the war while good men starved. "Pike," he said, and the name tasted like ash in his mouth. He reached out and covered her hand. Willa flinched for a second in the daylight, but she did not pull her hand away. "You are not crazy, Willa," he told her, his voice firm. Her eyes were wet but still fierce. "I know," she whispered, "but knowing it doesn't change a single thing." "It just might," Elias said quietly. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his eyes never leaving hers. "We're all out of coffee," he said, "and the flour is getting mighty low." Willa took a deep breath and slowly pulled her hand back. "We need to go." "Time to head down," she said. "We have pelts, and you are well enough to ride." He just looked at her. "I am not leaving you to face this winter or Pike alone." She wanted to argue that she did not need a protector, but the words would not come. "Fine, we go together," she finally managed. "But if we get killed, I will not forgive you." "I will surely keep that in mind," Elias said, looking out toward the valley. The town of Blackwood lay far below, a dark stain on all that white snow. The old pain in his side was nothing compared to the new one in his chest. He was now fighting for the girl with the wild eyes and broken heart, a much more dangerous fight. The thaw came on hard, with a crack of creek ice sounding like gunshots. That deep, white silence of winter was finally broken by the sound of melting. Eaves dripped, snow slid from the pines, and the world turned to mud. The air was still cold, but the sun was working longer now, turning snow to slush. Inside the cabin, the walls felt like they were closing in. The lard was almost gone. The flour sack was empty, and the coffee tasted like burnt wood now. Willa stood by the table, counting the pelts from her long winter's work. There were 6 fine beaver skins, a dozen muskrat, and 2 beautiful silver fox pelts. It was a good haul for supplies. "We have to go down," she said, not looking at him. Elias Ward glanced up from oiling his boot. He was a healed man now. His face was no longer gaunt, and his side was just a puckered pink scar. He moved with his old, quiet grace, a thing she found herself watching more than she liked. "I will go saddle Banjo," Elias said simply. Willa's back went stiff. "You do not have to. I have made this run 100 times on my own." Elias set his boot down, his gray eyes looking right through her tough exterior. "Willa, I am eating your food and sleeping under your roof. I owe you my life. I am not letting you ride down there alone just to haul back 50 pounds of flour." He stood for his hat. "Besides, a man forgets how to talk to anyone but stubborn mountain women." She huffed. "You are fit to ride?" "Fit enough," he said, settling his hat. and I am going." She did not fight him. Part of her wanted the solitude she always kept as a shield. But another deeper part of her felt a wave of relief wash over her. The thought of facing that town alone suddenly felt heavier than any pack saddle. They rode out an hour later. The trail was nothing but slick mud and rock, their horses stepping carefully. Willa took the lead, rifle at her side, her hat pulled down low. Elias was right behind her. He kept his eyes on the hills, a habit from the war he could never shake. As they rode lower, the air grew heavy with the smell of wood smoke and coal. The town of Blackwood sat in the muck below, looking rough and temporary. The closer they cawed, the straighter Willa sat in her saddle. She looked like she was bracing for a fight, her whole body tensed up. She checked her knife, then the pistol tucked in her coat. Elias saw her getting ready. He moved his horse, Banjo, up next to hers, close enough for their stirrups to touch. He did not say a word. He just placed himself between her and the town, a quiet, steady shield, by him. Willa looked over at him but did not move away. They reached the main street, a river of thick, brown mud churned up by wagons. The town was busy, full of men shouting and women trying to keep their dresses clean. But when people saw Willa, everything changed in a heartbeat. A hush fell over the street. All the talking stopped, and every head turned their way. A woman on her porch grabbed her little boy and slammed the door shut behind them. Elias could hear the whispers from the shadows, calling her the wolf girl. He felt a slow burn of anger. He saw nothing but hard, hateful faces. He saw the mean smirk on a blacksmith and the pure disgust in another man's eyes. Willa just stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched tight. She rode through their hate like it was fire, refusing to let them see her pain. They stopped at the hitching post for Gable's General Mercantile store. Elias dismounted, his boots sinking a good 2 inches into the mud as he tied up his horse. He turned to help Willa, but she was already down grabbing her bundle of furs. "I got it," she said, throwing the heavy pack onto her shoulder. Elias stepped back but kept a hand near his gun, watching the street as he followed her inside. The store smelled of pickles and sawdust. Mr. Gable was weighing a sack of sugar. He was a balding man with sweaty skin. He looked up when the door chimed. His welcoming smile died the second he saw Willa. The other customer hurried away. She scurried to the other end of the counter, like Willa was carrying a plague. She dropped the furs on the counter with a heavy thud. "I need flour," she said, her voice flat. "And coffee, salt pork, and a box of 44 cartridges." Gable offered no greeting. He untied the bundle, flipping through the pelts with 2 fingers as if they were dirty. "Beaver prices are down," Gable said, not looking at her. "Silk is in now, not fur." "These are prime winter coats," Willa said. He just shrugged. $4 for the lot." Willa went still. $4? Why, that fox pelt alone is worth 10. "Take it or leave it," Gable said, turning his back to fuss with a candy jar. "Not many folks want things that smell of the wilderness." The insult was clear, and a rancher's wife snickered. Willa's hands clenched into fists. All her freezing, hard work dismissed as trash. Just then, Elias stepped forward, his spurs chiming softly on the floorboards. He came to stand beside Willa, a towering presence, and set his hat on the counter. Leaning forward, he looked at the storekeeper. "Weigh them again," Elias said quietly. Startled, Gable looked up at Elias, at his broad shoulders, the scar, and his cold gray eyes. "I beg your pardon?" Gable squeaked. "You heard the lady," Elias's low voice rumbled. "These are prime winter pelts. I have seen the prices in Denver. Beaver is steady. And silver fox is rare. You are trying to cheat her because you think she is alone." The room went dead quiet. I run an honest business," Gable stammered. Sweat popped out on his forehead. "Then prove it," Elias said. "Give her the market price. Or I will take these furs across the street. The stagecoach driver knows good quality." Gable swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Willa and the stranger beside her. He licked his lips. $12, he muttered. 15, Elias countered, and a tin of peaches. Gable grumbled but reached for his cash box. Willa stood there, completely frozen. She was shocked, but also deeply humiliated. She had fought her own battles since she was 14. For this man to step in and be obeyed just because he carried a gun made her feel small. But before Gable could count the money, the bell over the door chimed again. A chill filled the air as Harlan Pike walked in. He was a man who owned any space he entered. He wore a charcoal coat that cost more than Willa's cabin, and his boots were spotless. He had a neatly trimmed silver mustache and eyes the color of frozen slush. Behind him stood three men, his big foreman Dutch and two other men. The other two were hired guns, their hands resting on their revolvers. Pike took off his hat. His hat came off, showing thick iron gray hair. His eyes swept the store and landed on Willa with a cold smile. "Miss Kane," he said smoothly, "it is a rare day we see you in town." Willa turned slowly, her face pale but her eyes blazing like a wildfire. "Pike." He stepped closer, smelling of expensive cigars. "It must be mighty lonely for a young woman out there." Her hand trembled as she reached for her coins. "I managed just fine." Pike glanced at her pelts. "A hard life. Your father wanted better for you." "Do not speak of my father," she hissed back at him. Pike then raised his voice for the whole store to hear. "A real tragedy. What happened to her folks. Most would have died of grief, but she ran wild. Some say she forgot how to be civilized." Willa grabbed her flour sack to leave, but Pike moved to block her path. "What is the hurry?" "Back off, Pike!" A new voice cut through the air, calm but sharp as a razor. It was Elias, now standing right there at Willa's shoulder, ready for anything. Pike looked him up and down with a sneer. "And who might this be, another stray you found?" "The name is Ward," Elias said simply, "and the lady is trying to leave. Step aside." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Ward, I have heard about a drifter who does not know his place." "My place is wherever I am standing," Elias replied, not giving an inch. Pike chuckled without any humor. "You have guts, but defending damaged goods gets a man in a heap of trouble." He stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "Accidents happen in these hills. Stray bullets." Elias met his gaze. "Are you threatening me, Colonel?" Pike's smile vanished completely. "It was major, actually, and I am offering you advice. I am always looking for a man who can shoot. I would pay $50 a month." Look in Elias's eyes. It was the look of men he had seen before battle. "Ward," Pike said, testing the name. "I heard tell a drifter has been causing trouble for my surveyors." "My place is wherever I happen to be standing," Elias said. Pike chuckled. "You have got grit, Mr. Ward. But men who take up with damaged women often find themselves in a bad spot." He stepped closer, invading his space. "These hills are a dangerous place," Pike murmured. "Accidents can happen. Rock slides, fires, even a stray bullet. It would be a real shame to waste your talents protecting a wild girl like that." Elias did not even blink. "Are you making a threat, Colonel?" Pike's smile vanished. "Major, actually. It is advice. I am always looking for men who can shoot straight. You could earn $50 a month riding for me." "I would rather rot," Elias said flatly. The air in the room went tight. The foreman's hand drifted to his pistol, and so did Elias's. "Stop it," Willa shouted, jumping right between the two men. She glared at Elias, her eyes furious. "We are leaving right now." She grabbed his arm and pulled, but Elias held Pike's gaze, a silent promise. Pike just tipped his hat with a mocking grin. "Y'all come back now, Miss Kane." Willa stormed out of the store and straight into the mud. She marched right for the livery stable, fuming with every step. When Elias caught her arm, she spun around and shoved him. "You fool! Were you trying to get yourself killed?" she hissed. "He was treating you like dirt," Elias shot back. "I never asked for your help," Willa yelled, not caring who heard. "I handled Pike by staying out of his wet, not by drawing a gun on him in. He was lying about your family. You wanted me to just stand there?" "Yes," she cried, her voice cracking. "That is how I stay alive. By being the crazy girl that nobody bothers with. Now he sees us." She turned away, shaking. "You just made everything worse. You poked the bear, Elias, and now he is coming for us." Elias felt a sick feeling in his stomach as he watched her tremble. "Go load the horses," he said quietly. "I have some business at the livery." Willa wiped her eyes. "What kind of business?" "Just go," he said. He walked toward the stable, his boots feeling heavy in the thick mud. The livery was dark and smelled like damp hay and horses. Elias leaned on a stall, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "Got a light, stranger?" A voice rasped from the shadows. An old man sat on a hay bale. Elias held out a lit match, showing a face full of wrinkles. "I saw what happened over at the store," the old man wheezed, lighting a pipe. "You got a death wish, son?" "Maybe," Elias said. "I just don't like bullies." The old man gave a dry laugh. "Harlan Pike ain't a bully. A bully just pushes you down. Pike buries you." He spat. "Name's Jeb. I used to ride for the Kane family before the fire." Elias tossed his cigarette. "You knew her father?" "A good, honest man," Jeb said. "Pike wanted his water. The Kanes had the creek head. Pike made offers, then threats. Then it was blamed on Indians." Jeb looked Elias dead in the eye. He said, "Son, Indians do not ride in a snowstorm at night, and no Ute war party leaves a trail straight to the Lazy P bunkhouse." Elias moved closer. "You saw the trail?" "I saw the brand," Jeb whispered. "The night before the fire, I saw 3 riders near the Kane's place. The moon hit the silver on their spurs, Pike's men." "Why did you not say something?" Elias asked, his voice tight. Jeb snorted. "And end up dead? I got it all by staying quiet. But seeing that girl today, looking so much like her mama." He pulled a crumpled paper from his vest. He pushed it into Elias's hand. "Ben Carter," Jeb said. "He was a young fella, one of them riders. He was not mean, just took orders. He quit Pike a week later, started drinking hard. Last I heard, he is mining silver in Oro City. He knows what happened. If anyone has a conscience, it is Ben." Elias stared at the name. Ben Carter. "Watch your back, Ward," Jeb said, returning to his whittling. "Pike owns the law, but he does not own the past." Elias tucked the note in his pocket. "Much obliged," he said, walking back into the street. The town felt different now. The mud looked like a trap. He found Willa by the horses, supplies already loaded. She sat stiff in her saddle, staring at the mountains. "Let's go home," Elias said, mounting Banjo. They rode out of town without a word, and the quiet between them was not comfortable. It felt heavy, full of things left unsaid. The long ride back was grueling. As the sun set, the cold hit hard, freezing the muddy trail into iron-hard ruts. The wind bit right through their coats. Elias watched Willa, thinking about the paper in his pocket. He thought of Pike's threat and the fear in Willa's eyes for the life she had built. He had broken her rules. He had made her war his own. They reached the cabin long after dark, unloading the horses by moonlight. Willa lit the lantern. The cabin did not feel safe anymore. Pike's shadow had followed them. She slammed the flour tin on the shelf. "You should pack your things," she said, her back to him. Elias stood by the stove. "What?" "You need to go," Willa said. "Pike made you a target. If you stay here, he will come for you. And he will burn this place to the ground to get to you." "I am not leaving," Elias said calmly. Willa spun around, her face streaked with dirt and unshed tears. "Why?" she yelled. "Why do you care? I am nothing to you. You paid your debt when you bought the supplies." "This is not about a debt," Elias said. "Then what is it?" Willa demanded, stepping closer. Rumen shoved his chest. "Is that it? Pity? Do you just see some poor orphan who needs saving?" "I don't need your pity. I've survived bears and blizzards all on my own out here." Elias grabbed her wrists, stopping her. "I don't feel sorry for you." "That is not pity," he roared, his voice filling the small cabin. His chest was heaving with all the day's anger and fear. "You think I pity you?" Elias's voice shook. "Willa, you have more grit than anyone I have ever met. I have seen good men, soldiers, break under half of what you carry. You walk through fire and come out stronger." He pulled her close, their faces just inches apart. "I do not stay because I feel sorry for you. I stay because when I am with you, I feel like I am finally home." Willa just stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. The anger left her, replaced by a hotter feeling. She felt his rough hands on her wrists and saw the pure honesty in his eyes. "You make me feel real," Elias whispered. The air between them was electric. It would have been so easy to close that gap, to let the fire between them finally take over. Willa trembled, but not from fear of Pike. She was afraid of how much she needed him. She pulled her hands free and stepped back. Elias, she breathed, turning away. She gripped the table. We should get some sleep, she said, her voice unsteady. Elias slowly lowered his hands. Yeah, he said gruffly. We should. He walked to the window, staring out into the dark wilderness. He felt the paper in his pocket. With his back to her, he said, Willa, there is something else. I met a man in town. He told me about the night of the fire. Willa went completely still. He saw riders with Pike's brand. And he gave me a name, Ben Carter. He was there and he might be willing to talk. Elias turned to face her. If we find him, we can prove Pike did it. We can make him pay for everything. Willa looked at him with wide eyes. Justice. It was a word she had almost forgotten, but seeing Elias standing there so solid and determined, she felt a flicker of hope. Ben Carter, she whispered. We find him, Elias said, and we end this whole thing for good. Willa nodded. She looked at the man willing to go to war for her. We end this, she agreed. The wind howled outside, but the silence inside was now filled with a plan. It was filled with a promise and a terrifying love that neither dared to speak of. The silence in the cabin over the next few days was heavy, but not empty. It felt like the thick, charged air right before a big Texas thunderstorm was about to break. Harlan Pike's threat hung heavy in the air, thick as smoke. Elias moved through his days with a hard focus, always watching. But in the evenings, his eyes were always on Willa. She paced the small cabin, her hands never still, as if fear was chasing her. On the third night, as sleet tapped the window, Elias put down his knife. Willa, he said softly, tell me about those spurs. She froze right where she stood. She did not turn around. I already told you, her voice was tight. It was a raid. I do not care what the sheriff wrote down, Elias said. I care what you saw. You said you saw silver spurs. Tell me the rest. She gripped the shelf, her knuckles white. For 10 long years, she had buried that memory, pushed it down deep. To speak it aloud felt like letting the fire back into her own home. But she looked at Elias. He was not looking at her with pity, but with patience. He looked like a man who knew the only way out was straight through. So she began. The wind was howling that night, she whispered. My pa was reading by the fire. I was supposed to be asleep in the loft, but I was peeking through the floorboards. The dogs never barked, she said, her eyes seeing a different time. That was the first sign. Then the door burst open. There were 4 of them, in masks made from sacks. Elias sat like a stone, letting her finally speak the truth. Pa stood up, she trembled. He reached for his rifle, but he never touched it. The first man shot him in the chest. Just like that. No words. He fell backward, into the fire. She hugged herself, shivering. Ma screamed. She tried to run, but another man caught her and knocked her down. I wanted to help Elias, but I was frozen stiff. I could not even breathe. Then Ma looked right up at me. She put a finger to her lips, telling me to be quiet. A tear tracked a clean line down her dusty cheek. They poured coal oil everywhere. One of them struck a match. The whole world just turned orange. As they were leaving, the firelight caught the spurs of the man who shot my father. The lazy P, Elias said, his voice low and cold as a grave. The very next day, Pike came to town, Willa said, her eyes hard now. He called it a tragedy, claimed our land was abandoned, and then he took it. They said I was either part of it or that I had just gone crazy from grief. I learned a hard lesson that night, Elias. The law is just a story men tell to excuse what they take, and safety is a fool's dream. The only real safety is high ground and a loaded gun. Elias stood and walked over to her. He stood close, a silent shield. That ain't right, Willa, he said softly. She looked up, surprised. You are not alone in this anymore, he told her. He paced to the window, looking into the night. I know about ghosts, he said. I carry a whole graveyard of them myself. He rested his head on the cold glass. I was a scout with the Union, he said, the 3rd Regiment. I thought I was fighting for a noble cause. But after the war, out on the plains, we were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting families. He turned from the window, his face in shadow. I led a column to a village on Sand Creek. The commander said it was a war party. He showed us maps and gave the order, but it was just old men, women, and children. Elias's voice nearly broke. I tried to stop it. I rode to the major and told him it was a terrible mistake. He looked at me like I was a bug. He said orders were orders. I watched men I knew turn into monsters. I did not fire a single shot, Willa, but I did not stop them either. I could not. He looked down at his own hands. I walked away from the army that day, left my uniform in the dirt, and never looked back. I have been drifting ever since. A man who stands by while that happens does not deserve a home. I figured I was just as bad as them. Willa closed the distance between them. She reached out and took his hand, her rough fingers gripping his. You are not like them, she said with a fire in her voice. You are here now, standing between me and Pike. That's a good man's work. And they stood there in the quiet cabin, their hands clasped together. The past was still there, but now it was shared. And by sharing that heavy burden, it somehow became lighter for them both. In the days that followed, the feeling in the cabin changed. The danger was still there, but the sharp edges were gone. They moved around each other with a new, quiet understanding. It felt both sweet and risky. She would watch him chop wood. He would stand a little closer while she cooked. They started sharing small smiles over their morning coffee. It was a fragile kind of peace, but their truce was built on the edge of a cliff, and they both knew it. One evening, cleaning their rifles, Elias finally said what was on his mind. We need to find Ben Carter. Willa looked up from her rifle. The old miner? Jeb said Carter was with Pike's crew that night, Elias explained. Jeb said he has a conscience. If we can get him to testify to a judge, Pike will hang for what he did. Hang Pike? Willa said. Elias, Pike owns the local judge. He owns the sheriff, too. Maybe so, Elias said, but he does not own the territory marshals. With a witness, we can go right over the local law. We can take this to Denver. It sounded like a long shot, a real Hail Mary, but looking at Elias, she saw a flicker of real hope. When she saw his jaw set firm, a little hope sparked inside her, and that was terrifying. She could not take another loss. But doing nothing, she whispered, was just waiting for Pike to run them out. Exactly, Elias agreed. We take the fight to him. But before they could even make a plan, the fight came right to their door. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon. The snow was turning to slush, and the air smelled like wet pine and mud. Willow was up on the ridge checking her rabbit snares. Down below, Elias was in the clearing. He was splitting firewood, the crack of his axe echoing. Suddenly, he stopped mid-swing. His head snapped up. He heard hoofbeats, heavy and coming on fast. He dropped the axe and grabbed his rifle. His Henry rifle was leaning on a stump. He scanned the trees and saw 4 riders coming up the trail. They were coming from the south. He glanced up to the ridge. Pike's men could not see Willow up there. If they knew she was with him, they would use her against him. He let out a sharp 2-note whistle. It was their signal to stay hidden. Up on the ridge, Willow froze and ducked behind a boulder, knife in hand. Her heart was pounding as she watched 4 men ride into the clearing. It was Dutch, Pike's foreman. He had 3 hired guns with him. They rode good horses and fanned out, circling Elias. Their hands rested near their guns. Afternoon, Dutch called out, his voice like gravel. Elias kept his rifle held steady across his chest. He was not looking for a fight, but he was ready for one. You are trespassing, Elias said calmly. Dutch just laughed. Whose land? This is open range. Or maybe it belongs to the Lazy P. What do you want? Elias asked. Just checking on things. Dutch's eyes roamed over the cabin and the woodpile. The boss wanted to make sure you were comfortable. He worries about folks out here all alone. You know, accidents can happen. I recall him saying that, Elias answered. You tell Mr. Pike I am fine, and I do not scare easy. Dutch leaned forward, chewing his cigar. You got a woman up here with you? He asked with a nasty grin. The wild one? We smelled somebody cooking. Elias lied smoothly. I live alone. Dutch stared hard, not believing a word. But with that rifle pointed his way, he was not about to argue. Not today, anyway. Dutch struck a match on his saddle horn and lit up his cigar. You know, Ward, he said, blowing out a cloud of smoke, fire is a funny thing. It can keep a man warm, or it can burn his whole world down. Best be careful with it. Then he flicked the lit match. It was not an accident. It flew through the air and landed in a patch of dry fern. Even with the damp ground, the dead ferns caught fire right away. A little flame licked upwards. Dutch just grinned. "See you around, Ward," he shouted as he wheeled his horse around. The other riders laughed and followed him down the trail. Elias did not even watch them leave. Rifle and raced toward the blaze. "Water!" he yelled, knowing she was too far to hear him. He stomped at the flames, but the wind was quicker, tossing a spark into a dry juniper bush. The whole thing went up with a whoosh. Willa came tearing down the ridge, sliding on the loose rock. She saw the oily black smoke. "The shovels!" she screamed. For 3 brutal hours, they battled the fire. The wind pushed it uphill, away from their cabin, but right into the heart of the timber. They used shovels, blankets, and pure grit to beat it back, choking on the thick smoke. It stung their eyes and filled their lungs, and the heat was so strong it singed their eyebrows. They dug a fire break through rocky ground until their hands were raw and bleeding. Elias swung his axe like a wild man while Willa threw dirt until her arms just about gave out. Finally, as the sun went down, the wind died. The fire sputtered and slowed, hitting the wet snow line higher up the mountain. They stood in the middle of the ruin. A black scar stretched up the hillside, with acres of trees now just smoking skeletons. The cabin was safe, but their peaceful place was violated. Willa dropped her shovel. She stood there in the ash, her face streaked with soot and sweat, just trying to breathe. It was all too much. The constant fear, the fight, and the old bad memories. It all came crashing down on her, a sound ripped out of her, half a sob and half a scream. "I am so tired," she cried, her voice cracking as she fell to her knees in the ash. "I'm so tired of fighting." She covered her face with her filthy hands. "Every time I build something safe, they burn it. Why can't they just leave me alone?" Elias tossed his shovel down and walked over to her. He dropped to his knees beside Ether. He did not say a word. He just pulled her into his arms. Willa stiffened for a second, trying to hide how broken she felt inside. But his warmth was too much to fight. She collapsed against his chest, clutching his shirt. She cried for her father and her mother, for the girl she used to be, and for the hard, lonely woman she had become. She cried until there were no tears left. Elias just held her tight. He rested his cheek on her hair and rocked her gently. "I've got you," he whispered. "I am right here." They did not get the cabin. They did not get us. He rubbed her back, his hand large and steady. "I will not let them take anything else, Willa," he vowed, his voice rough with smoke. "I swear it." She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her face was a mess of dirt and tears, but to Elias she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was raw and real and alive. His gaze shifted, grief burning away, replaced by a fierce hunger, a desperate need to cling to life even when surrounded by death. "Elias," she whispered, reaching up with a shaky hand to brush her fingers against his cheek. Her thumb traced along his jawline. Elias stopped breathing for a moment, eyes flicking from her mouth to her eyes. He saw the unspoken invitation, the yearning. Leaning in, their lips met, not a gentle peck, but a fierce collision. That kiss tasted of smoke, salt, and raw desperation. Willa let out a soft sound and drew closer, arms wrapping tight around his neck. Elias groaned, fingers tangling in her hair, holding her face close. The kiss deepened, hungry, urgent, a release. It was months of cold nights spent back to back, dangers faced together, and silent longing poured into one moment. It was a claim, a promise. For long seconds, the world shrank to the fire of their lips and pounding hearts. The blaze on the hill faded from their minds. The threat from Pike vanished. There was only them. Slowly they pulled apart, breath rough, foreheads resting together. Elias's hands cradled her face. Willa gripped his shoulders tight. Her wide eyes, weird and wild, held a new kind of fear. "I'm scared," she whispered. Elias's thumb stroked her cheek gently. "Scared of Pike?" he asked. "No," she shook her head. "Scared of this, wanting you." Her gaze dropped. "In a world like this, men take what they want. Women pay the price. Desire's a trap, Elias. If I let myself want you and then lose you, I'll break." Elias lifted her chin with a finger. "Listen close, Willa. I'm not a man who takes by force. I'm not a man who leaves." He brushed a soft kiss on her forehead. "Whatever happens, it's your choice and mine. We ain't trapped. We're choosing this, choosing each other. Willa searched his face and saw the truth, a chance at something real, partnership and control she'd never known. She breathed out slow and shaky. I choose you, she whispered. Elias closed his eyes briefly, relief flooding over him. Then I'm yours. He stood and helped her up. Come on inside, the wind's picking up. They left the scorched hillside behind, stepping into the warm cabin air. They washed grit and soot from their faces, the simple act of Elias wiping her nose. Willa handing him a towel, feeling intimate and true. Sitting on the bed, their knees touched. Outside, danger had sharpened everything. We can't stay here, Willa said quietly. That fire showed us if we do, he'll just burn us out or pick us off from the trees. Elias nodded, taking her hand, fingers weaving together. We got a ride to Oro City. Find Ben Carter, he added. It's a 3-day ride. Willa nodded. Through the pass, and if Pike's men catch us there, we're ready. Elias squeezed her hand tighter. We know this land better than they do. We get the proof, bring it to the marshals in Denver. We'll put the law on Pike's head. Willa asked, and then what? Let it burn. We'll find our peace. Willa looked around the cabin, but then she looked at Elias and knew. Home was not the wood or the stone. It was the man standing right beside her. We ride at dawn, she said. They were too tired to think, resting on the bed in their clothes, ready for anything. Elias pulled her close, and for the first time in a long while, Willa did not feel so alone. Their guns were close by. They were a team now, and they were heading into a fight. The morning came up cold and gray, making the whole valley look like it was made of old bones. Inside the cabin, all the warmth they had built over the winter was just gone. Elias stood at the table, packing the saddlebags like a man who'd spent his whole life on the move. He packed up what little they had, some dried beef and the last of the coffee. It was barely enough food for 3 days if they were careful. But being hungry was nothing new to either of them. Willa moved quietly through her own home. She touched the familiar things, saying her goodbyes without a word. She gathered her few treasures, a small knife and a box of matches, into a leather pouch. And she pulled out the silver locket that belonged to her mother, holding it for a second. The cold metal felt real in her hand before she tucked it deep in her coat. The cabin felt small now. For years, this place was her fortress, but now she knew Harlan Pike was watching it. After what his men had done, the walls felt as thin as paper. This was no longer a safe place. It was a target. Elias swung the bags over his shoulder. Horses are ready, he said. Willa just nodded. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the cold stove. She walked right to the heavy wooden door and pressed that charcoal hard against it. She drew a simple picture, a half-circle sun rising over a jagged mountain. Elias watched her. What is that? He asked. It's a mark, Willa told him. It means this place is claimed, that it is watched over, not abandoned. She wiped the black dust on her pants. If Pike burns it down, then he burns it. But he will know he did not run me off, and he will know that I am coming back. Elias looked at the rough drawing, then at her. In that moment, he understood it all. She was not just claiming a cabin. She was claiming her right to live in this valley. He gave a slow, sure nod. We will come back, he promised. Then they stepped out into the biting wind. They left the door unlocked, but the message was as clear as day. The journey to Oro City would be hard. The trail snaked up into the mountains, where the air was so thin it burned your lungs. The high country was showing its teeth that day. The wind howled something fierce. The path was a slick ribbon of rock, with a long fall waiting on one side. Willa took the lead, her eyes reading the land like an open book. She could feel where the snow was unstable long before the horses did. Elias rode drag, his eyes scanning everything behind them. He watched for any little sign that they were being followed. They didn't talk much. The wind stole the words right out of their mouths. But when they stopped, their teamwork was a quiet, easy thing. They moved like they'd been riding together for a lifetime. He'd steady her horse without a word. She'd hand him jerky without him asking. It was like they were two halves of the same whole. On the second night, they camped in a thick grove of spruce trees. They kept the fire small, just a little flicker against the big dark. The cold was a heavy weight, and they sat shoulder to shoulder by the flames. Elias poured coffee. How far? Willa asked, her voice low. Reckon we'll see the camp from the ridge about noon tomorrow, he said. Then we walk in. Willa looked bone-tired, staring into the fire. You really think he'll be there? This Ben Carter? She asked. A man like that sticks to his habits, Elias replied. He'll be where the whiskey is cheap. Willa sipped her coffee. I hear those mining camps are hell on earth. Close enough, Elias admitted. Greed makes men ugly. You let me do the talking. She gave him a sideways look. I can handle myself just fine. I know you can, he said gently. I just prefer not to cause a fuss. A small, rare smile touched Willa's face for just a second. They settled into a comfortable quiet, listening to the fire pop. Elias stretched his legs toward the heat. You know, he said, I think sometimes about what I'd do if I ever settled down. Willa looked at him, paused to look at him. And what's that? He seemed a little embarrassed. It's a fool's dream, but I'd find a piece of land. Good water, clean air, up high. Willa said softly, like the valley. Just like the valley, he agreed. I'd raise some tough mountain horses. Ground. He looked over at her. What about you? You dream of more than just trapping? Willa was quiet for a spell. She drew her knees up. I dream of sleeping, she finally said. Just sleeping without one. Eye-open, she explained. I dream of walking into town and not having folks stare at me like some kind of stray. I dream of sitting on a porch, just watching the sun go down without worrying who is hiding in the shadows. She turned and met his eyes. I dream of being safe, just plain safe. Elias reached out. He took her hand, his grip warm and solid. We'll get there, he promised. We get the proof. We'll break Pike, and you'll have that porch. She squeezed his hand. And you will have your horses. When they sat while the fire burned down to coals, sharing a vision of a future so close you could almost touch it. When the coal got too deep, they spread their bedrolls together, sharing blankets for warmth. They slept under that big open sky, not as strangers, but as partners. Oro City was a scar on the mountain. It was a nasty sprawl of canvas tents and shacks made from old packing crates. The buildings leaned into the mud. The main street was a filthy mess from wagons hauling silver ore. The air stunk of sulfur, garbage, and the sharp smell of crushed rock. It was a town where hope came to die, replaced by a fever for silver. Elias and Willala left the horses. They hid them in a grove of trees a mile out. Walking in, their boots got heavy with mud. Willa pulled her hat down low, turning her collar up against the wind and the stairs. The noise hit them first, the crash of the mills, the shouting of men, and a tinny piano playing in a saloon. Keep close, Elias murmured. They moved through men with faces gray from rock dust. Mules plodded along, heads down. It was a chaotic place. They found the saloon Jeb had described, a low log building called the Lucky Strike. It was more solid than the tents, but it looked every bit as run down. Elias pushed open the swinging doors. The room was dim and lit by smoky lamps. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and cheap rye whiskey. Men crowded the bar and tables, their voices a low roar. Elias scanned the room. He was looking for a man hiding from his own memory. There, he said, nodding to a dark corner. A man sat alone at a wobbly table. He was slumped over a glass, his head in his hands. He wore what used to be decent cowboy gear, now all stained and worn. A bottle sat before him, half gone. They made their way through the crowd. Willa felt the miner's eyes on her like hungry animals. She kept her hand near her knife and followed Elias's wide back. They stopped at the table. Ben Carter? Elias asked. The man flinched and his head snapped up. He looked young, but drink had worn him down. His eyes were bloodshot and red. He looked at Elias with a whole lot of fear. Ben looked confused. Who's asking? He rasped. Elias sat down, saying, a friend. Willa took the chair next to him, her back to the wall, watching the room. I'm not buying whatever you are selling, Ben muttered, reaching for his bottle. My writing days are over. We are not here to hire you, Elias said. We are here to talk about the Lazy P and a night 10 years ago. Ben froze solid. His hand hovered over the glass. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale as a ghost. I do not know what you are talking about, he whispered. You best go. We are talking about the Kane homestead, Elias pressed, about a fire, and a little girl who vanished. Ben slammed his hand on the table. Shut up, he hissed. Are you trying to get me killed? I want to know why you did it, Willa said, her voice cutting through the saloon's noise. Ben turned slowly and peered at her. He saw her eyes, dark, fierce, and all too familiar. His jaw dropped. You, he breathed. It cannot be. You are dead. I am alive, Willa said. No thanks to you. Ben scrambled back in his chair like he had seen a true spirit. I did not. You were there when they killed my father, when they killed my mother, she said. Ben buried his face in his hands. God help me, I was there, but I did not shoot them, I swear. Pike said we were just going to scare them off. He looked up, tears in his eyes. When the shooting started, it was madness. I saw your pa fall. I saw your ma. He swallowed hard. Then I saw you, Ben whispered, up in the loft. I saw your face in the shadows. You were looking right at me. Willa held her breath, remembering the eyes. Pike had shouted to kill the witnesses. He told me to shoot, Ben said, his hands trembling. I could not do it. I could not shoot a child. So I fired into the roof. I yelled that I got you. I told Pike you were dead. Willa stared, the memory shifting completely. The shot was not for her. It was a lamb, a mercy. You saved me, she whispered. Ben let out a choked sob. I watched you run out into the snow. I prayed you would freeze, 'cause it seemed kinder than Pike. He reached into his coat. I could not stay after that, Ben said. So I took this. I stole it from Pike's saddlebag. I thought one day I might get the guts to show it to someone. He pushed a crumpled, stained paper across the table. Elias picked it up. It was a page from a ledger. The writing was neat. December 12th, 1869. Acquisition of Kane parcel. Obstacles removed. $40 paid to crew. Elias's voice was cold as ice. He called a family obstacles, Elias said. This proves he ordered it, Willa whispered, touching the paper. Ben nodded. But who is going to believe a drunk and a ghost? We will make them believe, Elias promised. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. You are coming with us, Ben. We are going to Denver. Denver? Ben laughed. Pike will hunt us down for sure. Elias stood up. We will protect you, but we have to go now. Just then the saloon doors crashed open. It was an ambush. Dutch the foreman stood there, a big shotgun in his hands. 3 of his men were right behind him, their dusters pulled back to show their holsters. Dutch's eyes scanned the room and locked right on them. A nasty grin spread on his face. Well now, what have we here? Dutch yelled. A little family get-together. Get down, Elias hollered, shoving Willa's chair over. She tumbled to the floor as Dutch fired. The shotgun blast blew their table to splinters. Wood and glass flew everywhere. The sound was deafening. The whole place went wild. Men dove for cover and the music stopped. Elias rolled and fired his Colt twice. One of Pike's men went down, grabbing his shoulder. Willa, move, Elias shouted. To the back. She scrambled up, yanking Ben by his collar. The boy was frozen stiff with fear. Come on, she screamed, pulling him along. Dutch reloaded his shotgun. Elias fired again, making Dutch dive for cover. Willa dragged Ben toward the back door through all the chaos. Elias covered them, walking backward and firing his pistol to keep the other men pinned down. They busted out the back into a muddy alley. The cold air hit them hard. Run, Elias yelled. They took off down the alley, slipping in the mud. They're out back! The saloon door slammed open. There they go, Dutch bellowed. Get 'em! Bullets zipped past, smacking into the wooden walls. Ben cried out and stumbled. I'm hit! Keep going, Willa said, pulling his arm. It's just a graze, move! They rounded a corner and hid behind some crates. Elias peeked out and fired 3 quick shots down the alley. He heard a man curse in pain. That bought them a moment. Into the ravine, Elias ordered, pointing to where the town ended and the ground fell away. They ran for it and jumped, sliding down the steep bank. Their clothes tore on the sharp branches. They landed in a heap at the bottom, just trying to catch their breath in the dark. Above them, they heard boots running on the boardwalk and men shouting. A few shots were fired blindly. Stay down, Elias whispered. keeping a hand on Willa's back as they hid in the shadows. Willa could feel Elias's heart beating fast. She could smell the sharp scent of gunpowder on him. Ben was whimpering, holding his arm. They were alive, but the hunt was on. They followed the ravine for 2 miles before they stopped under a small rock overhang, hidden by some bushes. In the pitch black, Elias lit a single match to look at Ben's arm. The bullet had cut a deep line across his bicep. It was bleeding pretty good, but it wasn't too deep. Willa tore off a piece of her shirt. "Hold still now," she said softly, tying up the wound. Ben winced in the faint light of the match. "They found us," he whispered. "Pike's got eyes everywhere," Elias said, his voice low and hard as he blew out the match. They sat in the pitch-black cold, the fight gone out of them, replaced by a deep shiver. Elias tapped his coat. "We have the ledger, but we can't make for Denver now." "They'll be watching all the passes," Willa said. "They'd cut us off before we even got close." Elias knew she was right. They were boxed in tight. "There's only one place to go, then." Willa looked at him in the darkness, feeling the heavy truth in his words before he even spoke. "Blackwood," she whispered. "We go back," Elias said. "We take Ben and this ledger straight to the town. We put it right in front of the judge, in broad daylight." "That's suicide," Ben moaned from the shadows. "Pike only runs that town because folks are afraid," Elias countered. "If we show them the truth, maybe that fear breaks." "And if it doesn't?" Willa asked quietly. "Then we die fighting," Elias said. "But we've stopped running." Willa sat back, her hand going to the locket her mother gave her. She remembered the charcoal mark on her door. "We go back," she said, her voice firm. The long night wore on, with Ben moaning in a fitful sleep. Elias and Willa kept watch near the cave entrance, the stars wheeling slow and cold above them. The fire they felt for each other had settled into a quiet, somber warmth. They knew what tomorrow could bring. Willa shifted, leaning her head against his shoulder. He didn't hesitate, just wrapped an arm around her. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm terrified." "Not for me," he said, "for you. I've spent my whole life walking away from things, Willa. Now that I've found something to stand for, losing it scares me more than any bullet." She turned her face into his coat, breathing in the scent of leather and mountain snow. "I lived 10 years in silence," she whispered back, "like a ghost. I would rather have one single day of truth with you than 100 years of hiding alone." He tightened his grip. "We're not hiding anymore," he promised, pressing his lips to her hair. They huddled there, 2 outcasts with nothing but a piece of paper and a stubborn kind of love. The odds were against them, but holding her, Elias knew he'd made his choice. He wasn't drifting anymore. He was anchored right here with her, and tomorrow they would make their stand. The sun didn't so much rise as it bled into the sky, a pale, weak light that didn't warm the frozen trail. The mountains to the west were just soft gray blurs against the thick, heavy clouds. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of day that holds its breath, waiting for the first sound to crack the silence. Elias rode on the left, his eyes constantly scanning the dark line of trees. His rifle was in its scabbard but untied, ready to go. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight. Elias was coiled tight as a rattler, his eyes scanning every rooftop for trouble. He knew this town's every hiding spot, every dark alley. Beside him, Willa sat stiff, her heart pounding against her ribs. Underneath her coat, she held the proof, Pike's ledger page and her mama's silver locket. It was a cold piece of metal against her skin, a reminder of the justice she was owed. That locket was her anchor, the one thing keeping her steady for what was coming. Ben Carter trailed behind, slumped over his saddle like a sack of grain. He was pale as a ghost, and it wasn't the heat making him sweat. His arm hurt something fierce, but it was fear that was truly bleeding him out. He looked like a man heading for his last walk, and maybe he was. "We're close," Elias said low. Willa just nodded, the bitter taste of coal smoke already on her tongue. "Remember," Elias told us, "we don't go to the sheriff. Pike owns him. We go to the people." "The church," Willa whispered. "That's right," Elias agreed. "It's Sunday. They'll all be there." They rode into Blackwood just as the church bell started its slow, mournful toll. The sound bounced off the valley walls, a heavy heartbeat for the whole town. The main street was nearly empty, with just a few folks hurrying toward the white church. They pulled up to the hitching rail, the wind whipping at their clothes. Elias helped a shaky Ben down from his horse. He gripped Ben's good arm. "Stand tall, son," he ordered. "You're the only honest voice we have today." Willa looked at the town that had shunned her for 10 long years and finally lifted her chin. "Ready?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong. Elias saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the pure steel beneath it. "Ready," he said. They walked up the steps and right through the open church doors. The warmth and the sound of a hymn hit them all at once. The church was packed with every rancher and shopkeeper in town. All the good folks of Blackwood were sitting in their Sunday best. Elias, Willa, and Ben stood there in the back, covered in trail dust and smelling of smoke. The singing began to sputter out, starting with the folks in the back. One by one, heads turned, and the hymn died away until the whole church was silent. The singing stopped, one by one, until only the preacher was left. His voice cracked high and lonesome, then faded into nothing. That church got quiet enough to hear a pin drop. The only sounds were the wind rattling the windows and Ben fighting for his breath. Willa stood there, straight as an arrow, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. Then a board creaked in the front pew. Heron Pike got to his feet. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a fine black suit, looking like the king of the whole county. He turned real slow, a songbook still in his hand. His eyes took in the intruders, landing on Ben, who was pale and shaken like a leaf. He saw Elias with his hand hovering right over his pistol, and then his eyes fell on Willa. For a second, Pike's calm mask slipped. Real shock flashed in his eyes, then a cold fire. But he covered it up quick with a smile that was all teeth. That smile never reached his eyes. "Miss Kane," Pike's voice boomed through the church, "and Mr. Ward, you all picked a mighty strange time to interrupt our service." He stepped into the aisle like he owned the whole building. "We're used to your wildness," Pike said, talking to the whole congregation now, "but bringing your rough friends and your trouble into God's house, that's a new low even for you." Folks in the pews started murmuring their agreement. A woman in the third row sniffed real loud. "We are not here to pray, Pike," Willa said, her voice sharp. It rang out, clear as a bell. This was not the scratchy voice of the girl from the mountains. This was a woman with a purpose. "We are here to testify," she said. Pike just chuckled, a dry, ugly sound. "Testify? Honey, you have gone plumb crazy. That mountain winter has scrambled your brains. You best head on home before you make a bigger fool of yourself." He motioned to the sheriff sitting up front. "Sheriff, why do you not show Miss Kane and her friends the door? They seem a little unwell." The sheriff, a portly man with a mustache too big for his chin, started to get up. "Sit down." Elias's voice cut through the air like a whip. He took a step forward, his hand resting plain on his pistol. The sheriff froze halfway out of his seat. "We are not leaving," Elias said flatly. "Not until y'all hear what Ben Carter has to say." Pike's eyes narrowed on Ben. "Carter, is that you? Last I heard, you were drinking yourself to death in Oro City. You look like something the cat dragged in, son." Ben took a shaky step forward, leaning on the pew. He looked at Pike, the man who had haunted him for 10 long years. Then his eyes found Willa. He saw the little girl in the loft, and the woman who had just dragged him through a firefight to save him. "I am sober enough," Pike, Ben said. His voice trembled, but everyone heard him. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors. "People I grew up with. I was there," Ben said, his voice getting stronger. 10 years ago, December 12th. Pike took a step toward him. "Ben, you are drunk. Do not say another word." "I was there," Ben yelled, his voice cracking. "I rode with the Lazy P crew. Pike was the one leading us." A gasp went through the church. The preacher just stared. "It was not Indians," Ben said, tears cutting trails through the dirt on his face. "There was no raid. It was us. Pike gave the order. He wanted the water rights. He told us to burn them out." Pike's face turned a blotchy red. "Liar," he roared. "This man is a no-good drunk. I fired him for stealing. I saw him shoot John Kane myself." But Ben yelled right over him. "I saw. Dutch shot Mrs. Kane and then he shot Pike. Pike told us to burn the house down and kill the girl. A heavy, shocked silence fell over the whole church. You could feel the air get thick. Folks had heard the whispers for years, but hearing it said out loud right there in the church, it was like the whole town's comfortable lie just shattered right in front of them. Pike saw the doubt in his neighbor's eyes and knew he was losing them. He whirled on Elias, his face twisted with hate. "You did this, drifter," Pike spat. "You turned this town against me because I wouldn't give you a job." "I don't want your money, Pike," Elias said, calm as can be. "I just want the truth." He held up a page from a ledger. December 12th, acquired the Kane parcel. Obstacles removed, in your own handwriting. Pike's composure just snapped. He looked at his men by the door and screamed, "Kill them!" The church exploded into pure chaos as folks screamed and scrambled for cover. Dutch, up by the choir loft, pulled his gun, but Elias was already moving. He dove behind a pew and fired. The sound was deafening in that holy place. Dutch fell backward, his gun clattering uselessly on the floorboards. The other two gunmen opened fire as Elias rolled and shot from the ground. "Get down!" Will yelled, throwing Ben to the floor as wood splinters flew everywhere. The air filled with gun smoke, burning your eyes and throat. One of the other gunmen went down, grabbing his leg, but Pike had used the confusion. He lunged through the smoke and grabbed Willa by the hair, yanking her up. Pike shoved a small revolver into her side. "Drop it, Ward," he screamed, "or I'll put a hole in her." The shooting stopped. The silence that came back was loud and awful. Elias slowly got to his feet, his chest heaving for air. He saw Willa in Pike's grip, the man's face a mask of pure desperation. It felt just like that terrible night at the fire all over again. "Kick the gun over here," Pike ordered. Elias knew if he did, they were both gone. He locked eyes with Willa. He saw the fear, but he also saw pure grit. She glanced down at Pike's leg, then right back at Elias. It was a signal. She wasn't that scared child anymore. She was a survivor. Then she let out a scream. Willa slammed her boot heel back with everything she had, right into Pike's shin. Pike howled in pain. His grip loosened for just a second, and his gun wavered. That was all it took. That was the only chance Elias needed. He did not shoot. He charged, covering the 10 feet between them in a flash. He hit Pike like a freight train, his shoulder driving into the man's chest. Pike's gun fired as they crashed. Elias felt a hot burn across his shoulder, like a branding iron, but he ignored the pain. They went down hard in the aisle. Pike was a big man, and he fought like a cornered animal. He clawed at Elias's face, trying to get the gun around. Elias slammed his forearm on Pike's wrist, pinning it to the floor. They struggled, their boots thudding against the pews. Elias drove his knee straight into Pike's gut. He grabbed Pike's gun hand and gave it a hard twist. A sickening pop echoed, and Pike screamed, dropping his weapon. Elias grabbed Pike's fine suit and hauled him to his feet. He slammed him back against the altar rail. "Stay put," Elias growled, pressing his own pistol under Pike's chin. Pike froze up, his eyes wide. He wheezed for air in the silent church. Slowly, folks started peeking out from behind the pews. Elias stood over him, breathing hard, blood seeping from his shoulder. He had him. He held the most powerful man in the valley at gunpoint. "Take a good look, everyone," Elias shouted to the town. "Look at the man who owns every last one of you." He pulled the ledger page from his pocket. He tossed it right at the sheriff's feet. "Read it," Elias commanded. The sheriff stood slowly. He looked at Pike, then at Elias's gun. He bent down and picked up the paper. "It says, 'Obstacles removed,'" the sheriff stammered. From the back, Ben Carter stood up. "He got rid of them," Ben said clearly. "He got rid of John and Martha Kane, and he tried to get rid of Willa." Pike looked around wildly. "Sheriff, do something," he rasped. "Arrest this man." The sheriff looked at Pike, then at the faces in the crowd. He did not see fear anymore, just pure disgust. The spell of fear Pike held over the valley for 10 years was finally broken. It was cracked wide open. The sheriff holstered his own gun. "I cannot do that, Harlan," he said. Pike's jaw dropped. "You work for me." The sheriff stood taller. "No, sir, I work for this town." He found a backbone he did not know he had. "And I reckon the town has heard enough." He pulled out his iron cuffs. "Harlan Pike, you are under arrest." Elias finally stepped back, lowering his pistol. He watched Pike until he heard the cuffs click shut. Only then did he let out a long breath. He turned and found Willa near the front pew. She was shaken, but she was standing strong. Elias went straight to her. He did not care about the crowd or the blood on his shoulder. He wrapped his good arm around her and pulled her in close. "It is over now," he whispered. "It is all over." Willa buried her face in his chest. She just held on tight, like he was the only solid thing in the world. Out here, justice does not come easy, and it sure is not clean. The days that followed were a whirlwind of lawmen from the capital. Pike's whole rotten empire began to shake loose at its foundation. The ledger, Ben's testimony, and that foreman squealing to save his own hide was enough. They hauled Pike off to Denver in a cage on wheels, and he never once looked back. Ben Carter signed the papers, but he was a hollowed-out man. He just drifted away one morning before the sun came up, looking for a place to forget. Back in town, things felt mighty strange. No one threw a party for Willa. The folks of Blackwood were just plain ashamed they'd let a lie go on for so long. It was easier for them to look away from Willa than to admit they were wrong. A week later, Willa was watching the sun dip behind the peaks. That same rancher's wife who'd snubbed her before walked by, paused, and gave a stiff nod. "Evening, Miss Kane," the woman said. "Evening," Willa answered. It was a start. Elias came up beside his arms still in a sling, but his spirit was strong. He watched the woman go. "They'll come around in time," he said gently. "I don't need them to," Willa said, her eyes fixed on the mountains glowing in the last light. "I don't belong here, Elias," she admitted. "Trying to fit in feels like a dress that's too tight." Elias just nodded. He knew that wildness wasn't just in the hills. It was in them too. "So what do you want to do?" he asked, his voice low. She looked at the man who had walked through fire for her. "I want to go home." A slow, easy smile spread across his face. "I was hoping you'd say that." They rode out the very next morning into air that smelled of pine and fresh starts. As they climbed, they left the muddy streets of the town far behind them. When they reached the ridge overlooking their valley, they saw the black scars from the fire. But even in the ash, tiny green shoots were already pushing their way toward the sun. The cabin stood right where they'd left it, solid and waiting. Willa swung down from her horse and walked to the door. The charcoal symbol was still there. She pushed it open. The air inside was cold and still, but it was theirs. Elias stepped in right behind her and shrugged off his heavy coat. He went over to the narrow bed piled with furs that had been their shelter. He sat down, stretched out his legs, and gave Willa a tired, happy grin. He looked at her, a real twinkle in his eye. "You know, I reckon I can finally sleep without my armor." Willa let out a genuine laugh, stepping close to look down at his handsome, scarred face. She remembered finding him on that mountain, half gone and broken. She remembered the fear and the loneliness, but realized those feelings were long gone now. Leaning in, she rested her forehead against his. "You are here," she whispered, "because I choose you." Elias gently touched her cheek. "And you choose me, every single day." As night fell, a cold winter wind howled outside the little cabin, but inside, a warm stove and a single lamp pushed back the darkness. Elias finally drifted off to a peaceful sleep, not once reaching for his gun. He did not even stir at the sound of the wind. Willa lay beside him, her head resting on his chest. She gently traced the lines on his hand, the scars that crossed over his lifeline. The world was still a hard place, and the West was not yet tame. But listening to the steady beat of Elias's heart, Willa knew they would face whatever came their way. They had carved out this life for themselves, earning it with truth and grit. Under a vast, star-filled sky, the wild land around them felt a little less cruel. They had found the one thing harder to break than the mountain itself, love. Well now, thank you kindly for listening to the story of Elias and Willa. I hope it sat right with you. I would surely love to know where y'all are listening from, so please leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed this tale, go on and subscribe to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. Your thoughts are what keep these campfire tales burning bright, so don't be a stranger.